We have a terrific panel here to talk about clean and healthy transport systems. Philippe Yvin, you're the chief executive of La Société de Grand Paris, which is a newly set up public corporation that really controls the new transport that will connect the whole Grand Paris region. William Chernicoff from the Toyota Mobility Foundation, Priscilla Baek, the policy lead for Asia for a very small startup called Uber. I think I've heard about it. And Emmanuel Vivant, you're the chief executive officer of RATP Dev Transdev Asie, is that it? And the managing director of the iconic Hong Kong Tramway company. So quite a very, very, very good panelists here. And you know, when we think about the future of cities, there's really nothing more important than what's happening now and in the future in the mobility and transportation sector. This is a sector that's fundamentally not changed in 100 years. It is now being massively disrupted in all sorts of ways. The electrification of cars, connectivity of vehicles, and of course, the arrival tomorrow, the day after tomorrow, in 10 years, of autonomous vehicles, of ubiquitous autonomous vehicles. This, in our view, will transform every city in the world massively in the next 5 to 10 years. And it's really one of the reasons why at the NewCities Foundation, we're more and more focusing on the question of the future of mobility. We are working very hard with the city of Los Angeles, which of course is one of the great iconic cities built around the motor car, but thinking very seriously about the future. We're working with Los Angeles on a major event on new mobility in November of this year called LA Commotion, 15th through 19th of November, and I invite you all to hop across the pond and have a look at the mobility future. Now, one of the reasons why mobility and transportation are important relating to the theme at hand, which is urban well-being, is that reducing CO2 emissions in cities is absolutely key to fighting climate change. And we know that 60% of global transport emissions comes from cities. Transport accounts for around 15-20% of global greenhouse emissions. And that could double in between now and 2050 if nothing is done. So, you know, it's a very, very important issue even for this country. Seoul, next door, the other side of the airport, has become one of the world's most polluted cities. And that's due in large part, not only, but in large part to vehicles and transportation. A lot of it's also due to coal-fired plants, but that's another story. So very, very, very important issue. Now, before we get to the sort of the nub of it, I want to just throw out a quick question to all of you, which is, in your view, what one city in the world do you think has really made the greatest strides to create a healthy transport system right now? Now, the only thing is you cannot say your own city. So, Philippe, is this too politically difficult a question for you?
I think the towns of North Europa.
Yeah, Scandinavia, North Europe, yes.
Yes,
Copenhagen.
Copenhagen, I was there a few months ago. It's really terrific what they did to promote shared mobility.
Yeah.
And especially also the use of cycling. That, I think 40% in Copenhagen of daily transport is by bicycle. That's extraordinary.
Right. And of course, bicycle use is zooming up in every city in the world. I mean, it seems to be a kind of cultural shift. William, what would be your sort of one fetish city for transport?
Well, you mentioned LA, and I think, I don't know if that influenced my comments or not, but I think they've made tremendous progress. Yeah. And there's different ways to look at it. And they certainly have a ways to go with which they're working on. But you're talking about transforming a city that was built around car culture to one that actually has multiple modes of accessibility now, big improvements in public transportation, local micro-transits that are occurring at the neighborhood level, and a concrete plan and vision to continue to transform that. So in absolute terms, have they made the biggest progress? Maybe not, but they've done a lot of change against some very difficult conditions, and I think they're on a path to continue that.
Exactly, and voters, of course, in California have voted in November for Measure M, which raises $120 billion over the next few years for public transportation infrastructure, which is probably one of the biggest programs anywhere in the world. Priscilla, what's your model transport city?
So I think the city that I have in mind is more up and coming. And I would say since I'm in Asia, most recently I worked in Kuala Lumpur. And I would say that KL has one of the highest car ownership rates among any kind of up and coming emerging Asian city. But the government has put a lot of funding and priority behind urban transportation planning, and their express train from their airport to the city is amazing.
Really? Okay. Haven't tried it.
They are really embracing ride sharing as a way of shared mobility. So the government is promoting not only transforming the mass transit and public transit, but also the way that people think about car ownership so they can utilize their cars more efficiently and for shared rides. So this is just my personal opinion, but I think KL is a very up and coming city for that. Yeah.
Kuala Lumpur, that's fascinating. Emmanuel, can't say Hong Kong, so.
So Hong Kong would be the easy answer because Hong Kong has a largest public transport model share than any other city in the world. 90% of the trips in Hong Kong are done by public transport, and no other major city comes even close. Cities like Singapore, Paris, Tokyo are at 60-65%. But I would like to give a slightly more unexpected, I guess, answer, and I would like to say Beijing. So Beijing is probably, when I say Beijing, you think it's crazy because when you think Beijing, you think about pollution, congestion, etc. But when you think about everything that they've done in the past 10 years, it's actually pretty amazing. For me, when I think about clean and green transport, I think there are mostly 4 items that you need to tackle. That's mass transit, that's non-motorized transport, that's demand management, so push measures, and that's transit-oriented development. And in Beijing, first mass transit, I was living in Beijing in 2007, 2008, just before the Olympics. When I was living in Beijing, there were 2 metro lines. You go to Beijing today, so 10 years later, there are 16 metro lines, I think, and the network is twice the size of the Parisian network. So the Parisian network was built over 100 years. In 10 years, they built a network that's twice the size of Paris. Then you think about non-motorized transport. In China today, any major China city, you will see shared bikes everywhere. Everywhere in the streets, you will see this new...
the stationless shared bikes.
Yeah,
some say
stationless...
Some say it's being overdone. I mean, it's too many of them, and there's no regulation. And
it looks kind of overdone, but it's there, and you cannot ignore it. Then you have the demand management, and Beijing has taken actually quite aggressive push measures, to restrict car ownership, to restrict the use of cars. So if you have a car in Beijing, there are certain days where you are not able to use your car, which is pretty drastic. You don't see that in many cities. And then maybe for the last item, I'm a little bit more embarrassed to find where transit-oriented development, I think there's probably still a lot that can be done in Beijing.
Yes.
So I think it's interesting because obviously a lot more needs to be done, but you cannot argue that they haven't done massive efforts to try to tackle the issues.
Good, interesting. Beijing. Now let's start with you, Priscilla, and Uber. And Uber has become one of the most extraordinary global phenomena in recent years, both in terms of its meteoric rise as a startup, its market valuation, the way it's penetrated and conquered the markets of so many cities around the world. But how does Uber really contribute to urban sustainability in the long run? I mean, what is the company doing? How does it fit into the future of healthy transport and clean transport?
Yeah. So, first of all, I'm really excited to be part of this panel because I think we get invited to speak a lot about, like startups and technology and disruptive technology, but clean and healthy transport systems is actually one of our key pillars moving towards a sustainable kind of mobility future. Uber just started off as a very small idea to touch a button and get a ride. And as we expanded to more and more cities, and currently we have about 5 million trips a day and 55 million trips a month, we realized that a lot of these people are going in the same direction at same times. And we realized that we could use our technology to solve some of the biggest city problems regarding transportation. So I think when we think about the future of sustainable mobility in cities, for us, it's all about shared mobility. So right now we are putting a lot of resources and our engineering talent and our operations and marketing talent into making sure that we have a future where every ride can be a shared ride. So right now we have a technology called Uber Pool. I don't know if some people in this room have tried it, but for years I think city planners, carpooling is a really kind of cool concept, but it's been hard to scale because if you are carpooling with your friends or your family, it's only a very few number of people that you can get connected to. But when you have a mass network inside a city where you could potentially be connected to hundreds of thousands of people that are going in the same direction at the same time, then all of a sudden you're able to scale that product and you can get more people into fewer cars. And so for Uber, all of the technology efforts that we're doing is to try to make it more, to have fewer, fuller, and more efficient kind of vehicles running around. And to make sure that even as we develop self-driving technology, that it's about a shared mobility future.
Thank you, very interesting. But if Uber is so committed to a kind of sustainable transportation future, and you're pushing sharing and Uber Pool, does Uber Pool exist in Asia, in Asian cities?
Yeah, we have Uber Pool in several Asian cities, yeah.
But in the United States, where Uber Pool exists, of course, in my city where I live, New York, and in other cities, it's competing directly with public transport. And when you say millions of people going in the same direction, well, usually that's public transport that meets that need. So Uber Pool, however, is, you're in some American cities, the charge has been made that you're undercutting the price of public transport, which means you're giving people the option to go into polluting cars as opposed to non-polluting metros. So how do you deal with that?
Yeah, we get that question all the time, actually.
So sorry to pose it again.
No, I think it's a fantastic question because I think that is a common perception.
Yeah.
So for Uber, our priority is actually, it's not to take away from the public transit, it's actually to be a complement to it. And the American Public Transport Association actually did a study recently where they said that services like Uber and other ride-sharing services actually increase the usage and utilization of public transport because it's able to provide that first and last mile connectivity. I'm not saying that there are people who would have taken some kind of public transport, like such as a bus or a metro, and then they may have chosen that day to take Uber. But I think we're also envisioning a future where people move from personal car ownership to a variety of modes of transportation. So whether that's taking an Uber or taking Uber and the subway or taking Uber and a bus, And so as we expand in cities, even though we're in approximately, I would say, almost 500 cities right now, ride sharing only makes up about 4% of all kilometers traveled around the world, according to an Economist study in 2016. So it's still a very small portion. So our goal is
sorry, I don't want to stay too long on this, but if you look in Los Angeles, for example, the numbers of commuters that use public transportation in Los Angeles using the metro system has declined this year. And that's largely because of the ubiquity of Uber and Lyft, et cetera. So, it's not such a clear picture, I think. But let's move to you, William, and ask you about how Toyota and the Toyota Mobility Foundation can, in the future, really best support local transport systems. And can you, how can you help reduce inefficiency, et cetera?
Yeah, so I think I'll extend a little bit on what
good.
was commented there, because you do see one of the opportunities on the nexus there, right? First, it's about messaging, right? It can't be about we're providing a service. In Bangalore, we're working with the subway system there to provide that last mile access, or first last mile access. And the way it's being framed is as an enhancement, as an additive. It's not a replacement to the metro. It's solving a problem that the public has in accessing and using that system. So that's one way. I think it's about understanding the linkages between the different modes. I think it isn't an either or, right? The society and the citizens that live in the urban environment or the suburbs or even further out have a diverse set of needs. And so one solution is not going to provide everything. Different modes provide efficiencies to different segments of society. And it's about that collaborative integration. Can the vehicles be tied in or supportive of the public transit system? Can they be additive? For those that need personal mobility, does it do so in an efficient way that is well integrated? But the options have to be there. We have to understand what the needs are and how to design the system. How does it fit within the regulatory framework? And so that's what we've been looking at. In a project that we have in Da Nang is also intended to be
in Da Nang, in Vietnam.
In Vietnam is intended to be complementary as well, right? It's looking a little bit forward, right? They don't actually have the problem with congestion yet, but the city's growing very fast. And so the idea that the personal mobility that the citizens use now probably isn't sustainable over the next couple decades. So how can we integrate in a shuttle bus system that then connects in with the larger BRT system that's going to be built and the other forms of public transit, but understand then how it connects into the, again, that first last mile. So it's a complementary integrated approach.
Right.
And about messaging.
Good. Philippe, let's talk a little bit about Paris, which is a city that we all love. I love. I have lived there I lived there for many, many years. Part of me is definitely Parisien. Let's talk about the Grand Paris project and how this can transform mobility in the capital. Would you give us an idea of what you're doing?
The Greater Paris project is a global and strategic project which was launched by former President Sarkozy 10 years ago. It's a project which combines the initiatives of national government, local authorities, and the private sector to enhance the place of Paris among global cities. And this project is based on the creation of a new transport network. This new transport network is a full automatic metro, 4 new lines around Paris. Our transport system is based on radial system, and now we have to connect the suburbs to the suburbs of Paris, and the new project is 200 kilometers.
Wow.
The existing metro is 200 kilometers, and the project is to double the size of the existing metro, with 4 new lines. And in addition to this project, as my friends of Paris Airport are in the room, We will also create an express line, RATP with our railway company. We create also an express line between Charles de Gaulle and the center of Paris. And with these 200 kilometers, we will have 68 new stations. It's, of course, very important because these 68 new stations are also a focus point for the new urbanization of the city. This new metro will transport around 3 million passengers when it will be finished in 2030. The existing metro is transporting now in Paris 5 million people a day. So 3 million more with these new lines. It will, of course, reduce the travel time, the daily travel time for a lot of inhabitants of Paris region, and it's also it will give a second life to the existing line, which are overcrowded today. And finally, we think that between 10 and 20% of the passengers of the metro are today car drivers. So it's also, of course, very important to reduce the car congestion in Paris.
Right. So 4 new lines, 200 kilometers of new lines, massive expansion of the network. That has a big price tag. Who's going to pay for that?
The project is around 28 billion euros. And the specificity of the financing of the project is that the Parliament gives to my company special taxes. You know, Paris is the first office center in Europe. And so we have a tax on office. All owners of offices pay the tax every year to the company. And with this income, we will have a very long-term debt. We will begin to have our debt next year. And so with this income, we will pay the new metro. We hope to finish to pay it around 2070.
Got it. Now I want to ask you a question, but because I want to move the discussion over to the whole field of autonomous vehicles. And, you know, Philippe, you're about to spend $28 billion, massive expansion of the Parisian public transportation network. Now, it could be that in the future, with ubiquitous autonomous vehicles, prices come down. Will that be a lot of competition to your public transportation network? And it's a question I want to ask for you as well, Emmanuel, how you see the future of autonomy and autonomous vehicles in Hong Kong and how you're planning for it. But first, Philippe.
Yeah. 43 of our 68 new stations will be interconnected with the existing system.
Right.
That's very important because with a regional train, it's important for inhabitants who come every day to Paris for work or for culture or for young people for find a job. And now we are thinking about the mobility around the station. That's very important to think today to what will be the mobility around the station for the late miles around the station. And it's a unique occasion for us to think about autonomous car will be there when the new metro will be open. And what kind of use for autonomous car around the new station? Of course, the electrical bus, because in 2025, I think, all the buses in Paris will be electric. And it's also important for the future passenger to find a car, find a bike, of course. And we are beginning to think what will be the place of autonomous car around the 68 station.
So it's a question that you're only starting to ask yourselves now, I see.
Yeah.
Emmanuel, Hong Kong, great transportation network. It would have been my choice for a healthy transportation system. How do you talk a little bit about Hong Kong and Hong Kong as a model, but also about how you are looking at the future of autonomy and how autonomy could affect a city-state like Hong Kong.
Okay, we as a company, as a group, so we think of the future of mobility as a PACE. So we have coined an acronym for it, PACE. It's personalized, autonomous, connected, and electrical. Okay, so that's how we see the future. However, I think that when we are trying to answer the question of this panel, which is green and healthy transport, before we think about the future, before we think about the cherry on the cake, we have to think about the basics and the foundation. Before this panel, I just Googled the list of the most polluted cities in the world, and we are talking about cities in India, we are talking about cities in China, in the Middle East, Saudi Arabia, cities like Jakarta or Bangkok. In many of these cities, what the topic that we are discussing now, they will be the next step. But first, we have to start with mass transit. We have to start with non-motorized transport. We have to start with the right city planning, and then we will be able to add the second layer. When we are talking about a city in Vietnam like Da Nang, I think Da Nang there's no mass transit system today, so we cannot think about what solutions like Uber or whatever will bring before we are thinking about putting the basics, so putting a proper mass transit system in a city like Da Nang, in a city like Hanoi, in a city like Ho Chi Minh City. Okay, then now to your question on autonomy. Personally, I don't think Hong Kong will be a leader in the field of autonomous vehicle. I know that from personal experience because I worked with the Hong Kong government in trying to develop some autonomous vehicle project in the West Kowloon Cultural District, one of the new districts that's being planned in Hong Kong. I think some governments are more conservative and risk adverse. I think the Hong Kong government is relatively conservative when it turns to the adoption of new technologies like that. So I think there will be the first real experimentations will be in other places in Asia. Singapore is actually
big leader, experimenting a lot with autonomy.
So I think Hong Kong will be we will be in the second wave, maybe not in the first.
Priscilla, Uber has obviously been massively investing in autonomy, in the autonomous future. Major autonomous testing program has just been completed in Pittsburgh. How does autonomy figure in the Uber vision of the transport future?
Yeah, so it's a big part of it. I think innovation is at the core of our company. So we feel like autonomous and self-driving technology will be a big part of the future of transportation. So that's why we are focused on it. We really think that it will bring a lot of great societal benefits. Right now, one of the biggest problems with cities is that a lot of the urban infrastructure is used for parking. And cars sit idle for something like 95% of the time because people go to work, they park, and then they leave it, or they leave their cars at home. And all of that space could be used for parks, for commercial centers, for homes.
And gas stations, by the way.
Gas stations. Yeah. Hopefully with autonomous vehicles, there will also be electrification, so it will also have lower carbon emissions. But I think a lot of the studies right now show that the bigger benefits of autonomous vehicles in terms of lowering emissions, in terms of reducing congestion, in terms of making sure that these parking spaces are turned into public spaces, is through the shared mobility narrative. So if you have, I think the International Transport Forum did a study that if a city transformed all of its kind of point-to-point transportation to shared self-driving fleets, that it would cut emissions in the city by 33%. Congestion would disappear. And so you can imagine for big cities where congestion is a huge problem, every day for commuters. And if we can imagine a future, it'll be, some time away, but we're going towards that future where you don't have to worry about congestion and spending hours in the car in a commute.
Well, theoretically, of course, it all depends on what kind of autonomous future we have, and some of you may be familiar with with Robin Chase, the founder of Zipcar and the sort of the leader of sort of shared mobility, who wrote a quite famous piece about 3 years ago, I think, saying in the future when autonomy really arrives, it's either going to be heaven or hell. And it's going to be hell if we have individually owned autonomous vehicles. So I'll just sit at home and have there's absolutely no extra marginal cost to send my autonomous Bentley out to a Krispy Kreme and bring it back with a kilo of donuts. And if you have everyone doing that, you have massively clogged streets and pollution and all sorts of things. Or you have a kind of heaven, which is a shared autonomous vehicle future. I think a lot will obviously depend on regulation in every country. So I think we're hoping it's going to be more the heaven than the hell, obviously. Yeah.
Yes, definitely.
But William, one aspect of autonomy that is often not thought about, but in my view is very, very important, is that it can be such a great help for some members of our society, such as senior citizens who can't drive or who no longer drive, who may be forgetful about where they're going and the car takes them exactly where they should go and brings them back. Or people with disabilities of one sort or another. I mean, this opens up a future of freedom and liberty for some of these people. And I know that Toyota and your foundation has been looking at this issue. Could you perhaps talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's exactly it, right? It addresses the limitations of access that certain segments of the society have, right? Of course, there's gray areas, right? There's full automation, or there's the autonomous or automation, and the extent that it solves problems. Can you help people drive? Does it allow them to extend the personal mobility ownership? But certainly for people who can't, it does provide access. There's certainly some challenges we're trying to face now. People with certain disabilities or limitations can't necessarily just call any autonomous vehicle. It might need a wheelchair ramp or some other device. And so we have a project where we're trying to figure out if there's a business model around that and how that could then help address that. But I think we've already started to see, and maybe you have even better data than I do, that part of the baby boomers and even some of the older generation are starting to use these on-demand services. They still have to be comfortable and understand how to use it. It still requires understanding how to use the app on the smartphone and having the understanding. But it is providing some access. The harder challenge is actually in the lower income communities, who there's still some economic and operational barriers that exist. So it's not just about the senior community. There's a whole number of other segments that still currently have some challenges in getting access to these opportunities. But they're challenges. We're working to try and solve them. We'll see how things go.
Let's talk a little bit about, because it's so much in the news, climate change and the Paris Accords and the surprising or perhaps not so surprising decision by President Trump to pull the United States out of the Paris Accords. How does a city like Paris and Le Grand Paris, what you're doing, how do you view these kind of global challenges like climate change? Can you talk a little bit about that and how it informs your work?
Yeah, I want to underline the link between transport planning and urban planning.
Yes.
Since 2010, the European Commission promotes the realization of urban mobility plan. That's very important. Now we are in Paris region, urban mobility plan between 2010 and 2020. 10 years of work. And what's important, we have now a legal framework for the urban mobility plan, and all the municipalities have to respect the urban mobility plan in their own urban planning. And that's, I think, a key point for the future, to have the connection between urban transport and urban planning.
Okay. Climate change, though. Yeah. Anybody want to tackle that? Because it's in the news. It's going to affect cities. Or do we? The fact that we're moving inevitably towards more electrified fleets, autonomous fleets, it won't be an issue.
I think it requires a little bit more sort of depth and nuance on the conversation. Electrification covers a wide range of things, right? And certainly we see the pure battery electric vehicle part of the conversation. But transportation is just one part of the issue, right? And even if we solve transportation, there are other sectors of the economy, petrochemical industries, primary metals production, other areas around industry and business that require reduction of greenhouse gas. Solving transportation slows and mitigates the rate at which we're having a problem, but it's not. And so if we view everything in a compartmentalized way, I think we're undermining some of the ability to solve some of these challenges, right? So when we talk about electrification, is it batteries, is it hydrogen, right? It's not an either or, but they both probably have a role. And if we don't understand the entire structure and concept and take a more systemic view to solving some of these things and understand how transportation integrates in with these other sectors of society, with the way the urban environment provides its energy and its services, we may be optimizing one solution and creating more difficulty for the others around large-scale energy storage, the ability to address and provide zero-carbon pathways to all of these services. But it's a steady, incremental approach, and it requires having that long-term vision and understanding so that we have a clear investment pathway forward. At the same time, we're faced with the fact that adaptation is probably necessary. And if we don't invest in effective adaptation, those that are most at risk are probably going to suffer the most. And that also has sort of cascading feedback effects on the energy intensity and the investment we have to make in sort of responding to problems instead of being prepared to deal with them. So we've got a very limited amount of time. This could probably be an entire conversation, and just sort of one final word. And again, it's not about the end use of the vehicle. There's still the fuel stream and the manufacturing process. So we are looking both upstream, downstream, and how it's used.
Right.
I think William makes a very interesting point. So I think when we are talking about global pollution, transport is maybe 15-20% of the source, and energy maybe 50%. Yeah. But when you talk about local pollution, so the pollution in our cities, the pollution that's really impacting the health of the urban citizens, asthma, bronchitis, strokes, heart attacks, etc. 80% of the local pollution is caused by transport. So that's where I think we can start the reflection. In Hong Kong, in the corridor where the tram operates, the pollution levels are unfortunately very often beyond the WHO standards. The tram is the only electric mode in this corridor, so we are the only ones that are clean. Unfortunately, our passengers are still breathing the bad air. So we are very good bringing clean solution to the local mix. However, in Hong Kong, energy is produced mostly by coal. So when you look at the big picture, we are not that good contributing to the global mix.
So hence we really have to we approach it globally. And of course the other thing, apart from PACE, I would add a T, which is transition or time. And a lot of that is, yes.
And there's one thing that hasn't really come up a lot in this conversation, that's freight. We've talked about the way we move people, but as we make progress there, then freight becomes the bigger issue in terms of energy contribution and the infrastructure investment that's needed. And so again, it requires a much broader view of how we think about solving these problems and contributing to these healthy urban living environments.
It could be, in the future, a lot of people work in urban agriculture, so cities grow their own food instead of having it transported in 3,000 miles. I hope you've all thought about some good questions. Do I see? Yes, sir.
One of the questions that I have is, congestion pricing seems to have worked really well in London and Singapore. And why haven't more cities adopted those types of schemes? Because it seems like it would be a win-win situation. You reduce carbon emissions, and it becomes a revenue stream for the city as well. Could one of the panelists address that, please?
Well, I'm a big advocate of that, and in Hong Kong, hopefully, it's been in the air for a very, very, very long time, but now the government is thinking about launching a test for congestion charging in Central, and hopefully it will come. And the reason why it's not come sooner in Hong Kong is because you have a conflicting special interest, so you will have a lot of contrarian interests that will be lobbying against the implementation of such measures. But I'm convinced that the testing that will be conducted will convince the public at large that it's the right way to go.
No, I was just going to say, I think the practical reason is probably when I was working in the Philippines, the government made it one of its priorities to try to see what they can do to solve the traffic in Manila, in Metro Manila, and congestion pricing came up as an option. And for mega cities like Metro Manila, where there is a huge diversity in income levels and people who utilize actually personal cars to commute back and forth from work, and there are not feasible alternatives to taking their car, it actually adds a significant amount of cost and it's an economic burden. So I think the government's
There's the diesel-powered jitney, of course it's an alternative.
So I think this is the practical problem, is like it actually has a social cost, and without the government providing alternatives for its people to be able to commute affordably and reliably, it's a very difficult decision to make.
William.
So a couple things. I think actually the data shows that in London, after several years, that actually the congestion rebounded. What's difficult to figure out is, did it rebound because people got used to the pricing, or did it sort of pull other demand in? It could be an effective tool, but it really matters how it's used. There is an equity issue. The people who can tend to afford to pay the congestion pricing tend to be the higher income, so it does push the lower income people into modes that may not meet their needs as well. And how that money is used is also very important, right? You have to align the revenue and the penalty you're paying with the externality you're trying to address. So if you take that money and then use it to invest in alternative congestion relieving solutions, you might have something. If you take that money and use it to solve something else, it may not be the most effective way to do it. There is some benefit on the margin in reducing energy consumption because you've perhaps improved the flow of traffic, but that is still a little bit different issue than the energy and environmental externality, which may be better solved through some other mechanisms. And we have to realize and think about and understand why people are driving or using the congestion exists, because there's an economic and societal value that those users achieve by moving to their work or other at that time. And so unless you can provide an equivalent solution that provides them with the same level of utility and benefit, you may not achieve the outcome that is really intended or desired, or you could have negative consequences for certain segments of society.
Good, interesting. Let's have Sir, the gentleman in the white shirt back there.
I'm Jim Walker, I'm from Walk 21. We run a network of cities encouraging people to walk, and it won't surprise you that my question therefore is about the cleanest and healthiest transport system there is, which is walking. And for millions of people, they don't have a choice. That is the way that they get around their cities. And yet we haven't mentioned it at all in this debate. So my question really is making sure that we don't forget it. We're talking about innovation, about new cities, and to be controversial, cities. I think what I'm worried about is that this right to walk and the right to enjoy the quality of that experience is getting forgotten because of this focus on too many of these other sort of future thoughts. And I will be controversial, but if we don't get this right, we can end up with places like parts of Songdo here, which, quite frankly, isn't a very nice walking experience. It might be a wonderful place to drive through and easy to park and have a great public transport network to the airport, but it's not that nice when you're out on the streets having a walk. So could I ask the panel what they're thinking about that? Thanks.
Great question. Who wants to tackle that one? Emmanuel, walking in Hong Kong.
I think Hong Kong, there's a lot of thinking about walkability in Hong Kong, but there's definitely a lot of progress that can be made there. So if I was to take example of good walkable cities, I think I will look closer to maybe to Europe. Some nice initiatives that have been taken, some in the US, in New York, for instance, there are some nice examples there. But I would definitely concur that it has to be a part of the mix.
Absolutely.
So that's what I was. For me, there are the two extremes. So there must be mass transit and non-motorized transport. These two must be the foundation.
Yeah.
And then we can think about connectivity, autonomous, electric, etc. But mass transit and non-motorized transport must be the foundation.
And there's no question that healthy cities in the future have to encourage walking and walkability, and that has to be part of the multimodal transportation future. William.
Yeah, no, I think there was an earlier panel that talked about the architecture and the layout and the design.
Yeah.
So I think that issue sort of falls in there, right? People will walk, or certain segments of the population will walk when it's convenient, right? You're not going to get in a car to go 3 blocks, and if you can get a lot of what you're done or need within a short radius, then walking is perfectly, an important solution. But you talked about elderly, you talked about other segments of society, and walking is not a viable option for all of them. And so, regardless of what the solution, walking needs to be part of it, biking needs to be part of it, mass transit, public transit needs to be part of it, ride share, and personal, individual owned mobility are all probably part of the solution, because there are certain segments of society who need those forms of mobility. And so it's important to think about, from a planning standpoint, how they integrate in, how they're designed, and how the system is operated. People will always go to the easiest or most convenient. So now you get into pricing mechanisms and other factors that can kind of shift and balance the load between the different options and make walking in other modes, viable and attractive. But I always worry when I hear individual sort of, and we need a role for advocacy for all these modes, but we have to be cognizant that we need everything, and if we don't come together and figure out how
and
they
have to
integrate
work
in,
together. Absolutely.
then we're going to lock out the options.
Good. No, I mean, autonomous mobility, shared mobility, electrified mobility, walkability, it is certainly a brave new world in front of us, and very exciting one that will transform cities everywhere. I want to thank you, were great panelists. This discussion could go on for all day, but it can't, alas, because we have some other ones. Thank you very much. You were terrific.
Thank you.